The scarecrow in the middle of his dying cornfield wasn't made of straw. It was a living Apache girl tied to a wooden cross. Silas wasn't a cruel man. He was just a farmer, 3 weeks from losing everything to the drought, hunting the source of the blight that was poisoning his last viable crop. He expected to see the wild eyes of a madwoman, a curse made flesh. But as he cut the thick ropes from her raw wrists, she didn't fight. She only looked at him with a soul-deep exhaustion and whispered in broken English, "No man wants me. Just let me die." Silas knew the townsfolk had put her there, a sacrifice to a god that had long abandoned them all. To help her was to invite their superstitious wrath down upon his already failing farm. But to leave her was to become the monster they thought she was. The choice was no longer about his land. It was about what was left of his soul. The knife, honed sharp for skinning rabbits, sawed through the final strand of rope. The girl's body, weightless as a sack of dust, slumped forward into his arms. For a moment, Silas nearly buckled under the unexpected load, a primal jolt of responsibility shooting through his weary bones. He felt the brittle heat of her skin through her thin deerskin dress, the unnatural tremor of a life about to gut her out. There was no struggle, just a surrender so complete it felt like a judgment. He scooped her up, his own muscles protesting from a day of backbreaking, fruitless labor. Her head lolled against his chest, a ragged mess of black hair and grime, and he began the long, slow walk back toward the silhouette of his barn. The world seemed to hold its breath. The cicadas went silent. The air, thick with the smell of sun-baked earth and dying corn, felt heavy, watchful. Each step was a decision, a choice he could still unmake. He could lay her down in the shade of a cottonwood, leave the canteen, and walk away. It would be a kindness more than she'd been shown by the righteous folk of Providence. But the memory of the massacre, the one he had run from all these years, was a fresh brand on his soul. The faces of the women, the silent pleas in their eyes before the cavalry charge. He saw them now, superimposed over the limp form in his arms. Not again. The words were a prayer and a curse inside his own head. He laid her gently on a pile of clean hay in the corner of the barn, the cavernous space smelling of dust, animals, and time. The last rays of sun slanted through the gaps in the boards, striping the dark interior with bars of gold, illuminating the clouds of dancing dust motes. She looked small here, almost childlike, lost in the shadows. He brought a bucket of well water and a clean rag, his movements deliberate, economical. He'd learned long ago that wasted motion was a luxury you couldn't afford. As he knelt beside her, she flinched, her eyes flying open, black pools of terror. She scrambled backward into the hay, her body coiling like a cornered snake, expecting a blow. "Easy," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. He held up his empty hands, palms forward, a gesture he knew crossed languages. "Just water." He dipped the rag, wrung it out, and extended it to her slowly. Her eyes darted from the rag to his face, searching for the trick, the hidden cruelty. After a long moment, she reached out with a trembling hand and took it, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was all bone and grit. While she cleaned the dust from her face, Silas inspected her wrists. The rope had rubbed them raw, leaving deep weeping welts. A wave of cold, clean fury washed through him, so potent it momentarily cleared the fog of his exhaustion. This was not the work of God. This was the work of men. He turned without a word, went to the small tack box where he kept his supplies, and returned with a tin of thick, pungent salve. He didn't ask permission. He simply took her wrist, his grip surprisingly gentle, and began to apply the balm to the wounds. She hissed at the sting, but didn't pull away. They stayed like that in the dying light, a silent tableau of shared, unspoken pain. Night fell, bringing a chill that did little to cool the simmering heat of the day. Silas sat on the porch of his small farmhouse, the barn a dark hulk against a star-dusted sky. He ate a cold meal of beans and stale bread, his gaze fixed on the single lantern he had left burning inside the barn, a tiny flame of defiance in the vast, oppressive dark. The sound came first as a faint vibration through the floorboards of the porch, the heavy, rhythmic beat of a large horse at a walk. Silas didn't move. He set his plate aside, his body going still, his senses sharpening. This was a different kind of listening, a skill from his hidden past that his muscles remembered better than his mind. The rider wasn't trying to be quiet. This was not a thief. This was a proclamation. A heavy-set man on a heavy-set horse emerged from the darkness, pulling up just beyond the halo of light from Silas's house. Deacon Miller, a man whose piety was as thick as his neck. "Silas!" The deacon's voice was a gravelly boom that seemed to crush the night's gentle sounds. He remained in the saddle, a deliberate posture of authority. "Preacher sent me. He's a man of deep concerns." Silas said nothing, letting the silence stretch, forcing the other man to fill it. He knew this game. Let the enemy show their hand. "Folks are troubled," Miller continued, his horse shifting impatiently. "The drought, the blight, it tests a man's faith, and in trying times the flock looks for a shepherd's guidance." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "The preacher, he's been blessed with a vision, a way to purify the land, a way to show the Lord our devotion." Silas picked at a loose splinter on the porch rail. He kept his eyes on the deacon's hands, which rested on the pommel of his saddle. He could see the bulge of a pistol holstered at his hip. "I'm just a farmer, Deacon," Silas finally said, his voice flat. "I'm not much for visions, more concerned with the dirt under my fingernails." A low chuckle rumbled from the deacon's chest. "That's your trouble, Silas. Always has been. Your eyes are fixed on the earth, not the heavens. The preacher says some things aren't meant to be understood by men like us. Some things just require sacrifice, a demonstration of faith." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. "You wouldn't want to stand in the way of the Lord's work, would you? The whole town feels this way. It would be a lonely and foolish man who thought his will was stronger than providence itself." Silas looked up, his gaze steady. He let the deacon see the exhaustion in his eyes, let him see the mask of a beaten man. "I'm just trying to save my farm, Deacon. Got no time for anything else." Miller seemed to accept the answer. He saw what he expected to see, a man too consumed by his own failure to be a threat. "Good," he grunted. "You keep to your dirt. Let the men of God handle the heavens." He pulled hard on the reins, turning his horse. As he rode off, he called back over his shoulder, a final, chilling benediction. "Some things just need purifying, Silas, with fire, if need be." The sound of the hoofbeats faded, and the silence that rushed back in was heavier, colder than before. Silas sat for a long time, the deacon's words echoing in the dark. This was no longer a moral choice he could make and then walk away from. He had interfered, and now the wolf was at the door. He had invited a war into his home. He pushed himself to his feet, the weariness replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He walked back into the barn. Anaba was asleep, curled in the hay like a fawn, the lantern casting a soft, warm glow on her face. In sleep, the exhaustion and terror had fallen away, leaving behind a beauty that was as fierce and wild as the land itself. For a moment, he just watched her breathe. Then, he turned and walked back to his house. The main door didn't have a lock, just a simple latch. It wasn't enough. He dragged a heavy oak dresser in front of it, wedging it tight. He went to the old dust-covered chest at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't opened in 10 years. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a Colt peacemaker. He unwrapped it, the familiar heavy weight settling in his hand. He checked the action. It was clean, smooth, ready. Standing alone in the heart of his besieged home, the gun in his hand, Silas Marsh made his vow. Not with words, but with the cold, hard finality of a chambered round. The smell hit him first, a thick, coppery stench of decay that choked the clean morning air. Silas leaned over the stone lip of his well, the rope still coiled in his hand, and peered into the darkness. Floating in the murky water below was the bloated carcass of a coyote, its fur slick and matted. It hadn't fallen in. He could see the clear marks of a rope still tied around its neck. This was a message, delivered with a brutal efficiency he understood all too well. They had poisoned his only source of water. They were choking him off the land, piece by piece. He spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled, simmering fury. The work was punishing. He hauled water in barrels from a stream 2 miles away, his muscles screaming in protest, his back a solid knot of pain. The farm, already dying, was now being actively murdered. On the third day, as he was rationing the last few drops for his remaining cow, he saw her. Anaba. She stood at the edge of his property, her gaze fixed on a rocky outcropping a half-mile distant, a place Silas had always considered useless, barren rock. She didn't speak. She just turned, looked at him, and then back toward the rocks. It was an invitation, a silent question. Weary beyond words, Silas followed. He watched as she moved through the withered landscape not like a stranger, but like a native. She ran her fingers over the bark of a struggling willow, crumbled the dry soil in her palm, her movements a kind of silent conversation with the dying earth. She led him to a place where the rock face wept a thin, dark line of moisture, a place he had passed 1,000 times and never seen. With a piece of sharpened wood, she began to dig, her actions precise and certain. An hour later, they had a small, steady trickle of clean, cool water pooling in the hollow she had cleared. It was a miracle born not of faith, but of knowledge. Over the next week, a new rhythm established itself. It was a partnership forged in silence. While Silas toiled with the brute force labor of keeping the farm from collapsing, Anaba moved through the periphery, a ghost of quiet competence. She'd leave bundles of edible roots he didn't know the names for on the porch. She found a patch of wild berries the drought hadn't yet killed. She was not a burden, she was a reason he was still surviving. One afternoon he found her in the pasture, a poultice of chewed leaves and mud packed around the leg of his sick cow. He'd been ready to put the animal down, but he saw something in her eyes, a deep, ancient certainty. He let her work. He saw her value, not in her vulnerability, but in her strength. Trust wasn't given in words, it was earned in shared struggle, in the silent mutual acknowledgement of two survivors refusing to break. But every root she found, every drop of water she uncovered, only twisted the knot of his dread tighter. She was proving her worth to him, and in doing so, making herself an even bigger threat to the town. They weren't just a farmer and an outcast anymore. They were a team. And Silas knew that a team was something Preacher Thorne could not and would not abide. The sky that night was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and black, with no moon to soften the edges. Silas saw the torches first, a line of angry fireflies cresting the ridge. He'd been expecting them. The deacon's threat had not been idle. This was the final purification. His heart hammered a steady, cold rhythm against his ribs. This was a different kind of fear from the slow dread of the drought. This was the old fear, the one he'd buried 10 years ago. It was sharp, clean, and horribly familiar. He moved with a speed his weary farmer's body shouldn't have possessed, his actions economical and precise. A tripwire here, a pile of dry tinder there. He didn't have a fortress, but he knew his land. He knew its shadows, its dips, its secrets. The mob flowed onto his property, a loose, shambling thing made of anger and fear, their faces grotesque and alien in the flickering torchlight. At their head was Preacher Thorne, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. "Cleanse the witch," he roared, his voice carrying on the still night air. "Burn out the sin." They descended on the barn first, the most vulnerable point. A dozen torches were thrown, and the old dry timber went up with a hungry whoosh. But Silas was not there. From the darkness of the cornfield, a well-aimed rock sent a can of kerosene placed there, that afternoon, tumbling into the mob's main fire, creating a wall of flame that split their numbers. Confusion erupted, shouts turned to screams. From the other side, a length of rope pulled taut, tripping the front line of men into a tangled, cursing heap. It wasn't an army's defense, it was a scout's war of ghosts and shadows. But there were too many. They regrouped, their rage focused now on the small farmhouse. As they advanced, a new fire erupted, this one shockingly close to the house, cutting off their path. Silas stared, confused for a half-second, before he saw her. Anaba. She wasn't running, she wasn't hiding. With a wet sack, she was beating at the edges of a fire break she had carved into the dry earth around the house, her small frame silhouetted against a wall of flame. She was a warrior, her weapon not a gun, but an unbreakable will to survive. The sight of her, fighting not for herself, but for their shared sanctuary, broke something loose inside him. This quiet, beaten-down farmer moved with the deadly grace of a panther, his fists and feet becoming weapons, a blur of calculated violence that disabled but did not kill. The mob, faced with a ghost in the darkness and a witch who commanded fire, broke. They fled back into the night, their righteous fury extinguished, leaving behind a smoldering silence. The aftermath was a wreck of charred timber and trampled earth. The barn was a skeletal ruin, but the house stood, an island in a sea of destruction. The secret was out. They were no longer hiding. They were at war. Standing in the ruin of his old life, looking at the soot-stained, defiant face of the woman who had refused to be a victim, Silas felt a profound shift in his soul. His goal was no longer to simply survive the town's madness. It was to end it. The days that followed were a waking fever dream. The farm was a prison, the town a ring of faceless enemies. They worked side by side, rebuilding a fence, salvaging what they could from the barn. The silence between them now filled not with tension, but with a deep, shared understanding. On the third day, the strain finally caught up to Silas. A smoldering beam had caught him across the back during the fire, a burn he'd ignored. The fever took him quickly, plunging him into a delirious haze of past and present. He lay on his cot, shivering, the world a blur of shadow and pain. He felt a cool hand on his forehead, smelled the clean, earthy scent of herbs. Through the fog, he saw a face leaning over him, a woman's face, her features blurred and indistinct. But her eyes, he knew those eyes. They were the eyes of the Cheyenne woman, the one he had tried to shield, the one whose name he never knew just before the cavalry captain had given the order. The words spilled out of him, a torrent of poison he'd held in for a decade. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice a stranger's. I was just a scout. I ran. God forgive me, I ran." He was no longer in the farmhouse. He was back in the snow-choked ravine, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Anaba listened, her face impassive, as this simple farmer's soul unburdened itself. She carefully cleaned the burn on his back, her touch gentle but firm. And as she worked, her fingers traced the puckered, faded geography of old scars. Not the scars of a farmer, not the marks of wire or splintered wood. These were the neat, round holes left by bullets. This man, this quiet, broken man, had a history written on his skin that he tried to hide from the world. In his feverish confession, she didn't just hear the story of a soldier's shame. She saw the truth of his deepest wound, a pain that mirrored her own profound loss. He was a survivor, just like her. A man haunted by the ghosts of those he couldn't save. And in that moment, in the quiet intimacy of that sick room, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. They were no longer a protector and his charge. They were two broken pieces of the same shattered world, who had, against all odds, found each other in the ruins. The fever broke like a summer storm, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. Silas sat on the edge of his cot, the morning light filtering through the farmhouse window. The pain in his back had receded to a dull ache, but the ghosts of his delirium lingered. He felt hollowed out, his deepest shame laid bare. He watched Anaba move about the small kitchen, her motions fluid and efficient as she ground herbs with a stone pestle. She hadn't mentioned his confession, hadn't treated him with pity or contempt. She had simply continued her work, her quiet competence a balm on his raw soul. He picked up his Colt from the nightstand, the cold, heavy reality of it in his hand. For a day, he had let himself believe this was the only answer. A single bullet for the preacher, and it would be over. Justice, swift and final. But as he looked at Anaba, her focus entirely on the healing remedy in her hands, he saw the flaw in his old-world logic. Violence was Thorn's language. To use it was to admit defeat, to become the very savage the preacher claimed he was harboring. To shoot Thorn would not kill the fear. It would make him a martyr, transforming his poison into scripture. The town would rally around his memory, their hatred for Anaba calcifying into a righteous crusade. He looked down at the gun, then at his own reflection in the murky window glass. He saw the face of the young scout who had run from a massacre, the man who believed that withdrawing was the only alternative to fighting. He finally saw the lie he had been living, his blind spot. This fight wasn't just about saving Annaba anymore. It was about saving a town from its own soul sickness. He had to defeat the idea, not the man. He walked over to where she was working. "That blight," he began, his voice still rough. "You said you knew it." Annaba didn't look up, her hands never ceasing their rhythmic grinding. "My people have known it for generations," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It does not come from a curse. It comes from a rot, a lichen that grows on the river stones upstream, where the water is slow and warm. When the rains stop, the poison concentrates. It starves the roots. It sickens the cattle. It is a sickness of the earth, not of the spirit." Silas felt a profound stillness settle over him. It was the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "A sickness," he repeated, the word tasting of revelation. "And a sickness has a cure." For the first time, she stopped her work and looked up at him, her dark eyes holding his. In her hand, she held up a pinch of the crushed green herbs. "A sickness has a cure," she agreed, "if men are willing to listen." In that moment, a new plan was forged, not in the heat of anger, but in the quiet light of a shared, impossible hope. They would not bring a gun to the house of God, they would bring a remedy. The church bell tolled on Sunday, its chimes carrying across the valley not as a call to hope, but as a summons to judgment. The air inside the small wooden chapel was thick with the scent of pine polish and unwashed fear. Preacher Thorne stood at the pulpit, a looming black crow of a man, his voice a mesmerizing cadence of damnation and glory. He was a master of his craft, weaving a spell of terror and righteousness that held the congregation captive. He spoke of the blight, the curse, the witch on the hill, and the righteous fire that must finally purify their land. His voice rose to a crescendo, his hands gripping the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles white. "And now," he thundered, "is the time for a final crusade, for the men of Providence to rise and cut the sin from our heartland." At that precise moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church swung open. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Every head turned. There stood Silas Marsh, and beside him, the Apache girl. The town froze, a tableau of shock and hatred. They expected a devil, a savage. They saw only a man, haggard but unbroken, and a woman, her face calm and her posture erect. Silas was unarmed. His presence alone was an act of supreme defiance. They began to walk down the central aisle, their footsteps echoing in the sudden profound silence. The crowd parted before them like a sullen sea. Deacon Miller, his face a mask of thunderous rage, moved to block their path. Silas simply met his gaze, a look not of challenge, but of weary resolve. The deacon hesitated, and in that hesitation, he was lost. They did not stop at a pew. They walked all the way to the front, stopping just below the pulpit where Preacher Thorne stood, momentarily speechless, his sermon of hate choked in his throat. Annaba did not look at the preacher. Her focus was on the front pew, where Deacon Miller's wife sat, her face a geography of despair, cradling her pale, listless daughter. This was the target, not the mass, but the one. Annaba knelt. From the simple leather pouch at her waist, she took out a small bundle of green, fragrant herbs. She held them out, not to the preacher, not to the deacon, but to the mother. "Your daughter is not cursed," Annaba said, her voice clear and steady, filling the silent church. It was more powerful than all of Thorne's thunder. "She is sick. The water is sick." She pointed upstream, a simple, irrefutable gesture. "There is a poison in the river. It has a name, it has a shape. It is not a demon." She crushed the herbs in her hand, the clean, sharp scent cutting through the stale air. "And it has a cure." Thorne finally found his voice. "Witchcraft!" he shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "The devil's remedies. Do not listen to her lies." But his words were abstract, hollow. Annaba's offer was real. It was green. It was fragrant. It was hope. The mother, looking from the preacher's rage to Annaba's calm strength, made her choice. With tears streaming down her face, she allowed Annaba to mix the herbs with a little water and press the poultice to her daughter's lips. It was a silent, devastating act of defiance. The spell was broken. Thorne's power, built on shadows and fear, could not withstand a single simple act of tangible truth. His authority dissolved into the sunlit dust of the church, leaving him as nothing more than a frail, raving old man. As if on cue, the sheriff whom Silas had sent for days ago stepped into the doorway, a folded warrant in his hand. 1 year later, the spring rains had returned. The corn in Silas's field stood tall and green, its leaves whispering in a gentle breeze. The air smelled of clean earth, of new life, of a promise fulfilled. From the rebuilt porch of his farmhouse, he and Anaba watched the town of Providence bustling in the valley below. It was a different town now, the hard edges of fear softened by a shared season of healing. He was no longer Silas the recluse, but Silas the leader, the man who had faced down a monster without firing a shot. And she was no longer Anaba the witch, but Anaba the healer, her wisdom sought by all. They stood together, their hands brushing, a comfortable, unspoken language between them. He had thought hiding from the world would protect what little he had left, but now he knew that true safety only came from building a world worth defending. He looked at Anaba, her face turned toward the sun, and understood. The scarecrow hadn't been a curse on his land. It had been the beginning of his harvest.